Max. We are live. Thanks for, I guess we should be thanking each other for coming on each other's shows today.
I know it's interesting that it took I don't know how many months to figure out that we probably could just do this on a regular basis and it would make a lot more sense.
Yeah, we only have to have one recording this way. It helps on our storage fees.
Our video editor, everything just one editing
Yeah.
job, everything becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, we're consolidating, we're merging. We're announcing a merger. No,
Yeah.
I'm just
A
kidding.
merger of the two podcasts.
So anyway, yeah, what's wild is it took some craziness going on the last few weeks, and I think this is good timing for us to do our first one. Just with everything going on in the tech world right now with censorship. I know this is something we've talked about quite a bit between us two, but I'd like to just kick off the conversation. Just what are your thoughts on just the state of everything going on? And just, for people that are listening, we're 2 days after Parler was essentially kicked off of Amazon server. So that's where we're at. We're recording on the Tuesday after Parler just basically got bullied off of the Amazon server. So that's just a little bit of context for anybody listening.
And yesterday GoDaddy kicked AR15.com off of their servers, although they had a backup. So yeah, I mean it's it's interesting. So I preface this conversation. I think we spoke about this at length, but like the challenging thing about having this conversation is that it seems impossible for people to objectively have this conversation, and have this conversation without it actually being viewed necessarily as political. But I think it's an important conversation to have because the ramifications are pretty significant for both sides. So like I'll try to look at this as from both because I'm not registered by any political party. I've voted for Democrats and I voted for Republicans in various elections, and I am not a Trump supporter by any means, and I didn't vote for him. If that says anything. So, but like what's happening right now goes beyond politics, and I think that's what the right now I'll say the left is struggling with because they're the not struggling with, but they're struggling to understand the ramifications here of setting precedent, right? And that's I think the biggest issue is what's being done right now is setting precedent that can then be used in the future to say, well, this has happened. So this has now happened. People have accepted it. So now it's normalized. And it's great if your side's in power, right? If your side's in power, it's awesome because you disagree with people over here and you think these certain people over here are bad and evil. And there are people over here that are bad and evil. And there's people that are bad and evil on every ideology, every political party, every religion. The danger, though, is that 4 years from now, 6 years from now, 8 years, 12 years, 20 years, whatever it is, there will be other political parties in power, right? The Democrats are not going to hold the majority. They're not going to hold the House, the Senate, and the executive branch for the next, 8 elections. Like things happen, right? So the risk is if you, no matter what political party you are, is that you now set a precedent that when the opposite party is in power and they disagree with you, they can now use this on you. And you're not going to be happy when that happens. So when that happens, you're now going to say, well, this is not fair and this is dangerous and everything. And so that's what I'm trying to have conversations about and try to think about is not so much like specifically what's happening right now and it being against conservatives, but more so just the fact that this has now become normal and accepted. Like it's now accepted that a handful of individuals who run the companies that control pretty much the entire world, the way we communicate and shop and interact, can unilaterally decide that this company is dangerous and bad, and we are going to essentially put them out of business within 48 hours. And that, again, is dangerous because who knows where we're going to be in 20 years. In 20 years from now, it could be this forced conservatives to build their own infrastructure. And maybe 20 years from now, they're the biggest companies in the world are owned by conservatives. And they decide when President AOC is in the executive branch 20 years from now, right, whatever, that they don't like her voice on the most popular platform. And they say, well, we're going to take you down. And so that's the bigger thing that I'm thinking about. It's not politics for me. It's about the fact that this can now be used against anybody because it's happened. And that's really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, if you are a believer in freedom of speech, which I still am convinced the majority of Americans support the First Amendment, which is good. Even moderate liberals I know are just like the parlor thing, I think was a little bit too far, which is great to see that even people on the left are like, okay, I don't necessarily agree with some of the stuff going on parlor, but I mean, if you and I have a couple things. I have some antitrust verbiage up here, but some key takeaways from antitrust laws are essentially what's gone on. I mean, the monopolies, which we can probably argue that Amazon is a monopoly. Um,
Collusion, companies
yeah,
working together.
they worked together to almost overnight like deplatform. And fortunately, there are some other options for servers that we believe a company like Parler is going to um, utilize. But that by definition is what like antitrust laws are in place
Yeah.
for, is to prevent what literally just happened. I mean, if they don't agree with, and I mean, what was said, the violation of terms of service was allegedly that there wasn't any filter in place to stop like violent text, right? Or like plan violent or coordinate violent attacks. Is that what the violation of terms of service was?
Yeah, so it seems to be the argument is the argument being made by all these companies, whether it's Shopify or Amazon, is that we can refuse business from a company that has that I don't want to say encourage, but facilitates dialogue and activity that leads to violence or illegal activity. And and listen, like here's I think again going back to just precedent. Here's the slippery slope here again. Like, did what happened was that terrible? Yes, it was a disgrace. All those people should go to jail for a very long time. Anybody that encouraged it should be there. There should be a lot of bad things that happen. The book should be thrown at these people. Um, the danger though, and this is like I was listening to Shapiro yesterday before we spoke, and he brought up a really good point, which is it's fine if you want to have rules, right? So if we're going to have rules and laws and standards by which we conduct ourselves and businesses conduct themselves, it needs to be universal. It needs to be applied in every instance to every single person. And I think that's what's really angering a lot of people is that these rules that these platforms have are not being objectively applied to everybody. Because if they were, then Twitter wouldn't exist, Facebook wouldn't exist, right? If the argument is that we took this company, this website down because a group of horrible, evil people, criminals, used it to coordinate an act of violence, an insurrection, whatever you want to call it, and therefore we need to remove them. Are you going to, can anybody really sit there that's listening to this or reading this and sit there with a straight face and say that through the entire life cycle of Twitter and Facebook and iMessage and all these platforms, that nobody has used those platforms to coordinate a crime or to organize a riot or to organize violence? Like, if anybody can really sit there and say that there's never been an instance on Twitter where criminals have used the tool to coordinate and facilitate a crime, then I'll shut up. But the reality is that that's just not the case, right? But the problem too is like it is impossible when you have platforms that have millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people on them. It is not humanly possible to moderate every single post instantly, right? Facebook struggled with it. Twitter struggled with it. Facebook's one of the biggest companies in the history of the world. They have more capital and team resources than any company in the world. And up until recently, I mean, they've still been getting shit from Congress and the government because they're not moderating enough, right? And they have thousands and thousands of people working around the clock. So Parler is a new company, and they didn't take posts down. And again, like, should those posts have been taken down? I think so. I think if you're posting about a crime and you're trying to commit an illegal activity, I think that's fair game to remove. But what's happening right now is the exact opposite of like Section 230, which was created to protect platforms. It's the exact opposite of what the law says, which is ironic. Like Section 230 was created to protect platforms because when the law was created, they realized these big online forums and these big platforms, it really started with like the phone companies, right? Like how can Bell, back when it was Bell, and like AT&T and these companies, are they responsible for everyone that picks up the phone and calls somebody to to coordinate a crime? No, they can't monitor every phone call, right? And same thing with these big online websites. They can't possibly moderate and analyze every single post in real time. It would be impossible. So the law was put in place to protect them and said, hey, as long as you don't editorialize and as long as you allow all content to be posted, it's a true platform, you can't be sued for libel, you can't be sued for these things. The irony now is that it's like basically now if you don't editorialize and you don't remove enough stuff, we're going to remove you from the internet. And I think it's crazy how that's happened. Like it's nuts that not everybody universally disagrees with this, regardless of your politics.
Yeah, and I actually have Section 230 up for people that don't know what that is. It was passed into law as part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. So it's definitely something that should be reformed and looked at this point. I mean, think about how the internet has changed since 1996. I think I remember like getting AOL CDs and magazines in 1996. Yeah. AOL 3.0 or whatever was back in 96. So that obviously needs to be updated. But just as a quick blurb of that, Section 230 generally provides immunity for website publishers from third-party content. At its core, Section 230 provides immunity from liability for providers and users of interactive computer service who publish information provided by third-party users. So where it gets tricky too is if you have a clear bias based on political leanings, which there's a big debate about this as well, that could open them up for liability because they're not like a free platform anymore if you're only censoring things from one political view. So it definitely needs a giant reform. It's super outdated. What do you think a possible solution is for this? Like, do you think it's just like one of Ben Shapiro's terms, willy-nilly? Is like willy-nilly, like let people do whatever they want, complete free speech? And again, the censorship thing is tricky too, because I think most people are in agreement to have some level of censorship on Facebook. I think most people agree, like probably seeing like a timeline full of dick pics is, both sides I think can agree that we should ban dick pics from your IG feed, right? So there's
horrible violence. There's certain content that universally people.
Speech, this is where it starts to get tricky, where it's speech. It's like specific content you can probably agree, graphic content, but speech, that's where we're playing with what we're playing with right now.
Well, it gets tricky too because the argument being made right now by a lot of people that agree with what's happening is that the First Amendment technically does not protect people in this instance. And it is true that the First Amendment was created with the goal of like your government can't stop you from saying things, right? And that made sense at the time because we just broke away from the king and we, the Americans that were there at the time had been suppressed and had been oppressed and couldn't say certain things. So we have this great new country and we want to make sure that people in this country can speak their mind and can have open dialogue and discourse without being thrown into a jail or murdered, right? Executed. So technically private companies can do whatever they want, right? That's where we're at right now, is that private companies are private companies. And if they want to say, I don't want to allow this, they legally don't have to allow this. I think what's interesting is if you think contextually, right? There's a lot of people who like contextualists and originalists about how they read the Constitution. Like if in 1776, if the founding fathers could even comprehend that, a few hundred years in the future, what the world would look like, and that most speech would be happening on a few platforms that are owned by a few individuals. Again, big assumption here. I'm trying to assume what the founding fathers would say and think, but I'm pretty confident. I'd bet a lot of money that they would have put some provisions in there that would also included them in the First Amendment, that the government and these massive companies can't infringe on it. Because basically you have, single digits of individuals who are unelected, unaccountable, that control these utilities that are where almost all speech and commerce happen, right? And so, yeah, you could make the argument that, hey, if you're removed from Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Shopify and Stripe and these different places, you technically can still say whatever you want, right? You still have the freedom of speech. You can go outside, you can yell. And that's a valid argument. But the problem is the amplification of your voice and the ability to have your voice really heard, that is taken away, right? Like I would say that Facebook and Twitter and these massive companies and Amazon and stuff, like that is the equivalent of, the forums and the public speaking of the 1700s and 1800s, right? Like that would be the equivalent of taking that away back then. It is where almost all communication, where almost all ideation happens, where almost all knowledge is shared, where almost all dialogue happens. And removing the president's access to, that's a whole other discussion we can have about like the justification of that and whether that was right or wrong. But if you cut those channels off, like, yeah, you're a private company, but you do control speech. I mean, almost all speech. So it is a fine line. I think that there needs to be some type of amendment maybe in the future that includes that, because I think the founding fathers, they were around today, would have drafted that differently given how speech happens right now.
Yeah, and I guess the private market solution to this challenge, and I don't know if people are that's where it gets tricky, is like Facebook and these companies are such a monopoly where like you and me are both outraged, and then I'm going to probably buy something on Amazon later tonight. Like it's just like it's so embedded in our lives. Like we could make a difference if all these people that disagreed with this just say, hey, we're not going to use Facebook, we're not going to use Amazon anymore because this disgusts us. But they're just like such vital parts of our lives. We would just be like suckers for not using Amazon. Like, I don't know how, like, I mean, I guess I could just start using like the dollar store in my town instead of just having it delivered to my, I don't know, but it is tricky. I do think though that we're starting to see, I don't know if you have Telegram on your phone. There's like a mass exodus to Telegram from some people. So I don't know how massive it's going to be, but I think it's very possible that these companies lose a little bit of market share. Is it enough that's going to motivate them to change their ways? I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's happened on both sides over the years, right? The left, they boycott Facebook. The right boycotts Facebook. It just goes back and forth, right? The left boycotts Facebook because they're not censoring enough. The right boycotts Facebook because they're censoring too much. But they all go back after a few months. Most people can't delete it. I think, but even like Telegram, I mean, Telegram's been out for a while. The problem is unless these companies silo themselves off and build all their own infrastructure and technology, like I don't know how Telegram, if they're on, I'd imagine that they use Amazon. Most people use Amazon. Between Amazon and Microsoft, they control almost all cloud computing. Like they can still be taken offline. Like if Amazon decided Telegram, people are using that to coordinate violence. That this is precedent and now it can be applied there. So it's scary now because like it's one thing for Facebook and Twitter and some of these companies to ban people and ban companies and even Apple. But like Amazon controls the internet. Like if you can't host anything, if you don't have a server, like you can't exist online. That's the scary, like what Amazon did is actually way scarier than like even Apple. Right, because you can still I can still open my Safari or Chrome on my phone and access any website mobile responsive, and it works just fine.
Yeah, so we can talk about that too, for the difference between the Trump ban and the Parler kind of tag team, like kick off these platforms. The Trump thing, in my opinion, although I know it makes a lot of people mad, that is their right, and they are correct. If he's specifically on numerous occasions violating agreed to terms of service, they have the right. And it's actually a really similar conversation to like one, I can't remember if it was 5 or 10 years ago, but remember the whole like bake a gay wedding cake conversation?
Yep.
It's very similar, but on the other side. It's like the Christians ultimately, and I think the civil conclusion was that it's my business. I can kind of bake a cake for whoever I want to bake a cake. Not that like hate speech and stuff, obviously I think everybody can agree is not good. So it's, but if I don't want to bake a cake for this customer based on whatever reason I choose, essentially, like that ended up being the winning argument. I think it's kind of some overlap here. It's like Twitter has the right, if Trump is violating terms of service, which I haven't looked into like each specific thing, but apparently he did on numerous occasions. So if that's the case, where they potentially open themselves up to liability, though, is if there's cases of inconsistency, I would think.
Which there is.
Yeah.
I think it's that, and it's also, this is where I get, again, like, these discussions are interesting, and I like having them because I try to make them as objective as possible, and even check myself, like, and I'm transparent. Like, personally, I think it's the right move, and personally, I think that Trump's rhetoric and his inability to concede the election when he lost and gracefully,
he
like,
definitely riled people up. Like, there's no denying.
I think there's absolutely no way you can argue that his actions the last few months did not lead to an emotional state that caused a group of people to do what they did. Now, it's hard to say, does this driving emotional response, does that equate to being responsible for the actions people take in the emotional response? That's another debate. But he is 100%. I think things would have looked better and easier. Things would have been better overall if he had just said, 2 months ago, came out when Joe Biden announced he was winning and said concession speech, right? And then handled the last 2 months peacefully and said, hey, I'm going to help I care about America and I care about our country, so I'm going to help the Biden administration do the best job they can. So personally, I think like him using Twitter and his platforms to push false information and to push, conspiracy theories, I'll put that in quotes, because technically the Hunter Biden thing was a conspiracy theory and it turned out to be actually true. But
Epstein was a conspiracy until that was true too.
Yeah. But that being said, I think the objective part of the non-personal feeling side of me that's just trying to look at this and like how this plays out 5 steps down the road because of the precedent being set, what you just had happen was a group of private companies essentially cut a duly elected U.S. president's ability to communicate with his constituents, with the American people overnight without due process. And whether you personally feel that he's a terrible president and a terrible person and he did terrible things, it still doesn't change the fact that he is still the president of the United States. And that is still that's bigger than any one person. That's the office of the president of the United States, of the most powerful country in the world. And, yeah, he can go on TV and talk to the American people or go out in the, public and talk to people. But really nowadays, if you lose all your digital connections, right, like you basically cut his voice off.
Yeah. What do you think?
Like a private company. And I'll finalize here is that there is a legal process for this. If you think that the president is a danger and he is unfit to run the country and unfit for office, there's a 25th Amendment. Like this has already been discussed. There's already a solution in place, which is if people feel if his cabinet and the House and Senate feel that he is a danger, then bring that forward and remove him from office legally. Like that's what's crazy about this is that essentially you have private companies that have been able to supersede a constitutional amendment, like which is legal, like a due process of removing the president from office. They've officially neutered him. He's still in office, but like he's done. He has no means of raising money. He has no means of transacting commerce. He has no means of communicating in any capacity with the American people, with the voters. And again, I think it's like objectively looking at this and playing this down the road into the slippery slope, because that can be done 20 years from now if conservatives control the media and stuff. That can be done to a Democratic president, like without having to technically invoke the 25th Amendment. If they can just say, hey, we don't have to even do this, let's just shut them down totally and remove their ability to basically do anything and talk to the people. Like that's the part that I think, again, like was he like rightfully like able to be removed? Yes, 100%. I think if Twitter was just acting universally about their policies, like he should have been removed as an individual. Did he say lots of bad, evil, like terrible things that I think rile people up? Yes, 100%. Did he post tweets about a term of service? Yes, 100%. Did he do a lot of things wrong that I 100% disagree with? Yes, 100%. Does it change the fact that he's still a president that I don't like or support, but he's still the president, and that's still somebody who was elected by the American people legally, and that there is a process to remove him from office? No, it doesn't change that. And that's the part I try to think about is like separate your emotions and separate your hate and disdain for this individual and just think about the office of president, how this sets a precedent that can now be used on any sitting president in the future, regardless of party.
Yeah, you touch on something there. Like the argument I've heard from the left is that he's the president of the United States. He has his press room. He can hold a press conference whenever he wants. He can fly a plane wherever he wants. What are your thoughts on that? Like he doesn't
It's
need social
well,
media to reach people.
two things. One, if you really believe that, then you shouldn't. Then it shouldn't. You shouldn't have had to remove him from social media because if you're basically saying that he can get his message out just as easily and just as effectively in a press pool or traveling the country, then why would you allow him to still do that, right? Like you can't say that him saying anything is so dangerous we can't let him speak, but also say that he can speak just as equally and fairly on these platforms. So that's one thing. I don't think that logic holds up. And two, rightfully or wrongfully, right? Like, I think it's more. I think a lot of this is Trump's fault because he spent years saying the media is evil and the enemy of the people. Like we all know that whatever he does in the press room is not going to be covered like objectively, right? Like we can all agree with that. And again, like, is that valid? I think a lot of me thinks it is so because if you spend years just berating these reporters in the press room every single time you have a press conference and saying they're evil and fake news, you can't expect them to share your message objectively in the future.
They
But
probably
that's the
still
reality of life.
should though. Like that's the whole point of journalism is, and again, I guess that's just we've shifted. That's a whole nother conversation too. Is we've shifted to like entertainment news, not like true journalists. Like how many true journalists are even left on like major news networks and New York Times and
No,
Wall
but
Street
they're not
Journal?
journalists. Yeah, I don't think there's a big difference nowadays between
There's
opinion
some.
writers
There's
and
some like a Chris
reporters.
Chris Wallace was shit on for like attacking Trump and just kind of being like, no, you probably can't say it. Like I respect a Chris Wallace type, and
Yeah,
like I know there's a few left here and there, but he like obviously identifies as a center right, but he's like, hey, I'm not just gonna like go with whatever somebody says because I want to find the truth. I want to challenge that belief system. Like there's also not too many true journalists left. I mean, I guess this is like a a giant cluster of just shit that's like all hitting the fan right now. There's like lack of like I feel like we're more partisan than ever. There's less journalism than there's ever been before. There's more control by these companies that seem to identify more left leaning. I think most people can agree with
don't
that.
even seem to. Again, it's not an opinion. It's I try to look at things with like it's data, right? So the the fact is that if you look at any of these companies and the public records of who makes political donations, because that's all public, it's like 98% of executives and individuals that work at Facebook, Google, YouTube, all these companies donate to Democrats. So again, it's not even just saying like this is a conspiracy that the big tech is left. It's like it's just data, and whether it's I don't people are allowed to have political viewpoints. Right? I'm not saying it's a bad or a good thing. Object like if it just happens that everyone that works at a company together believes one thing, like they're allowed to believe that thing and they can donate to whoever they want. But don't try to make an argument that like it's even that like there's mixed political viewpoints in companies because that's just not the reality.
Yeah, that is correct from everything that I've seen. In addition to like even if so like and a good point I never really thought about till just recently. Even if like Zuckerberg, who I think out of the big companies has done the best consistently to just be like, hey, like we're gonna be as much free speech as possible, and like the whole like he had Facebook employees walk out because he wasn't censoring Donald
Yeah, he
Trump.
got
So
a lot of hate for a long
far
time.
from like maybe perfect, but I think out of the big companies, he's the one that I've seen that stood for free speech more than Twitter, especially. But like, so like, let's just say at a leadership level, the leadership team can say, hey, we all lean left, but we appreciate the First Amendment and we're going to be for free speech. Content moderators and like people monitoring these posts are typically lowest of the totem pole. You know, younger people, which do lean left inherently, right? You know, content moderators. So even that, you have left leaning leadership combined with a bunch of, you know, younger left leaning content moderators. Like, even if leadership wanted to, and not that anyone expects these platforms to moderate content perfectly, like, but yeah, it does seem apparent that it's just very, very favoring of left leaning ideology from the top to the bottom, you know?
Yeah, there just needs. I mean, I don't know how this happens because the problem is what we truly need is we need an objective place to get information and interact with each other, that doesn't lean one way or the other, and doesn't have too much control where they can dictate what's fact and what's not fact. And but the problem with that is that's boring, right? So the problem always is that it started with the media, that the reason they started moving more and more towards these kind of opinion and these anchors who are really just like influencers and personalities, right? They're not really journalists. Like, they get big ratings because they have opinions and they're passionate about their viewpoints, and they share those viewpoints with people that believe in them. And so that drove ratings and increased ratings. The more people are opinionated. And then the same thing with social media. Like, what doesn't get engagement is fact. Just like, here's just the reality, here's the data, here's the facts. That doesn't get likes, shares, and comments. What does get likes, comments, and shares is posts that are very polarizing. And so we've built an infrastructure of how these companies are rewarded and how they make money on polarization. So there's no financial incentive for the media or social media, like traditional media and legacy media or social media, to just purely take things as they are and give them to the American people. Everything is spun one way or the other. And I don't know how that gets fixed. I don't know how that gets addressed, because people can say that's what they want, but they don't engage with it. And that, because they don't engage with it, it doesn't make these companies money, and they don't go forward with it, which is unfortunate. Because I do believe, and I think you believe this, we've talked about a lot of times, like, I think a lot of people, when you get down to it, are pretty middle of the road. I think most Americans are pretty down the middle in terms of their economic and social viewpoints. Maybe they lean a little bit one way, a little bit the other way, but it's not exclusive. They might lean a little bit this way on social issues, a little bit this way on economic issues, a little bit this way on this issue, and they can look objectively at, like, hey, I like the fact that Trump did this, but I hate the fact that he did this, this, and this. The problem, though, is the fringes, people on the far right and far left, they get all the attention because they're polarizing and their voice is getting amplified, and that continues to pull more and more people out to the extremes, and that's really dangerous.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think people deep down, like, I feel like I do. I mean, many people probably feel like they do, but do you feel like people want to be in a place with objective information, or like, because that doesn't seem to be the case for me. It's safer
No.
at a like subconscious biological level. We want to be with people that act the same as us.
Mhm.
It's a tribal safety mechanism. It's why, you know, we're as progressive, and I think we've come a long way, as long of a way as possible in freedom of religion and accepting people of different religions and races. And even with all that, Italians still hang out with Italians, Jews still hang out with Jews, like Jewish people, like it, we just hang out with who we like. So like, how do we motivate people to start getting more objective information? Like, what's the solution?
It's tough because what you're talking about is something that is ingrained in our DNA, and that like that primitive part of our brain that hasn't evolved over millennia, right? That kind of the brain stem that was there just when we were like reptiles, right? Like this, even things like confirmation bias. Like we want to be right. We want to find evidence that supports our position. Like we talked about this the other day. Like, I'd like to be optimistic and try to find a solution, but there's part of me that just it sees where we're at, and it sees where, like, what the problem is originating from, and those things are very, very hard to fix. Like, fixing the way people think is very challenging. Fixing the way people think, like way their subconscious works, is nearly impossible, right? There's certain things you can motivate and nudge people away, but like there's certain elements that you just throw like a boulder and are really hard to move. I think you need to have you need to get to a place where people are okay with being right and with being wrong, and people are okay with not being all in on one side. Right? I think that's the threat right now. The danger is that a lot of people have gone to a place where, in order to be welcomed into that tribe, you need to be all in or all out. Right? And we've seen that with what happened in the last year with the riots. We've seen that with what happened with COVID. We've seen that with all these big issues that have happened. If you agree with 95% of this tribe's viewpoints on how things are happening, but you have some differing views on 5% or 2%, you look at this, hey, this doesn't make sense, or this is not the right way to do it. You're saying you're ostracized. You're 100% like this person over here, even though you're nothing. You're way more like these people than these people. And that is, until that changes, I don't know how you bridge the divide. Like, until that changes, where you can be 90% in with this tribe, but 10%, have differing viewpoints, but still be accepted by that group. Like, I don't know. It's frustrating. It's frustrating to see it because it makes no sense, and it's so irrational, and it's so idiotic. But it's the way a lot of people are thinking right now.
Yeah, for sure. And again, like, I think we're both kind of fall into this place, and I think a lot of people in the country feel this way. It's just not popular to say, maybe with their friend group or whatever. But I feel somewhat, and I talked about it last week on my episode with Morgan, somewhat politically homeless, because I lean right on economic and Second Amendment, but and immigration, but I lean left on like foreign spending and like big military spending and drug laws and abortion. And it's like, who's my political friend group? Like tons of conservatives are like they think it's crazy that I think sex work should be legal. You know what I mean? It's like, like, I guess the first major party that will say on a leadership level, like, hey, these are our core principles, but even if you don't agree with everything we stand for, but you care about America, you care about the people, like, we still accept you. Maybe that could start making some progress, but I don't
And it
see
could.
that
I mean,
happening.
you've seen that with the Catholic Church has done that, right? Like, it's like the Pope over the years has come out and been more and more progressive around gay marriage and certain things. And that was out of necessity, right? Because if you're losing members and the world around you is changing, you need to change as well, even though you're one of the oldest institutions in the world. So I think there's obviously hope that if the church, one of the most powerful, oldest organizations in the world, that has one of the most strong, some of the strongest views in the world, can evolve and change, that political parties certainly should be able to. But yeah, it's frustrating because what you said is true. It's like, if you don't, people are unable and unwilling to accept others that have different viewpoints, certain viewpoints. So certain viewpoints people don't care about, right? But there's certain viewpoints that people, it's like, I think a lot of people are single party voter, like single issue voters. Like, one thing is what they really care about.
Abortion's the biggest thing every year, every election.
And so if you aren't in agreement with them, you're against them, and you are a horrible, horrible human being. And until that stops, it's going to be challenging, because there's a lot of people who disagree with me on a lot of things. My instant reaction isn't that you are a terrible person because you disagree with me and have a different viewpoint. It's, I disagree with you, and here's why, but I respect the fact that you have a different opinion. We've gotten to a point now with our country where it's, if you are on other sides of the issue, it's no longer just, well, I disagree with you. It's, you are a terrible human being. You're a racist or a sexist or a homophobe or whatever it might be. Like, there's labels for all of these things. and you automatic. I mean, they're doing it right now with basically the left saying anybody who voted for Trump is basically the same as the criminals who, uh, rioted and attacked the Capitol, and that's dangerous to lump 75 million people into a bucket made up of a few thousand people who are crazy and terrible. Like that is a slippery slope because again, you push people further apart. Like the more you do that, what ends up happening, this is what I'm afraid of is like, again, like we said, I think most people are in this middle group. They're a little here, they're a little left, they're a little right. But the more the people on the fringes say that, hey, you are like this fringe, you are terrible, you are awful, the more you push them that way because they're just like, this is bullshit. Like I'd imagine there's a lot of people right now who are pretty moderate Republicans, pretty moderate conservatives, and they're just like, you know what? Like I thought Trump wasn't a great president. I voted for Trump. I didn't like him, but I voted because I just didn't like Biden as much. But like now being called a racist and being called all these things and an insurrectionist and I'm a traitor because I voted for a guy who had some supporters that backed terrible things. They're like, well, screw you. I'm I'm more all in with them now. Like I despise you so much that I'm going to push myself further this way. And I think I don't know the end game. And I'm curious to get what your thoughts are on this. I don't, as somebody that's like a problem solver and just tries to think about like here's the issue people are trying to solve and here's what they're doing to try to solve it. I don't get the left's goal here, because if your goal is genuinely to stop the far right and to stop racism, because there still is racism. Like there's still people in this country who are racist. There's still people who are sexist. There's people who are homophobic. There's still bad people in this country. If your goal is to get rid of those people or have them change their views and accept everybody, the solution can't be to remove their voice and call them mean. Like all that's going to do, it's not going to stop them. It's going to isolate them even more. It's going to isolate them in these smaller and smaller groups where it's only communicating with radicals. Like, and that's what I don't get. Like this decision to kick people off Twitter and Facebook and force them to move to these really small fringe communities. All what guarantees they won't even see any content from people on the left. They won't even have the opportunity to interact with Democrats and vice versa. So like right now, like the algorithm has kind of started that fracture, but at least you're still on the same platform. Like at least there's a chance if you're on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, you might see a video from a Democrat or a Republican, vice versa, and be like, that's interesting. I didn't think that way. There's at least the opportunity that happens. If you keep doing this, there's zero opportunity that happens. And there's zero chance that people change their viewpoints because they're only going to exist in this really, really siloed off world where they're essentially, if this continues 10, 20 years from now, there's two realities. Like we're going to live in one country where two groups of people will literally operate in totally different worlds because everything they see and consume is shared from one side entirely. They don't see any other side.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely a possibility. And I may be more of an optimist, and it's something I've worked on for years and worked with coaches on and stuff, is just having tough conversations, adult conversations with people. And I think that's I don't know if it's going to be executed, but that's the only possible conversation I see. Is like I shared that I'm having LaShawn on the next week's episode for what's the difference between the BLM riots and the Capitol riots. Because me, more like nonpartisan, they're both bad. Any violence should be, people should be prosecuted and arrested. And, I want to talk to him about that. And he doesn't really agree with me on that. But typically when we talk, we've been playing a lot of video games. LaShawn, who was episode number 2 for me, he's going to be on next week too to talk about what's going on lately, which I'm excited about. We've been playing a lot of games lately, and he's like, you know what? He's like, I feel like racism is just heading in the wrong direction in this country. And I was like, I would love to have supporting evidence for that, because interracial marriages are at their all-time high. There's more minority, CEOs of Fortune 500s than ever before. So many data points are showing that it's been progressing the right way for decades. So I was like, not that we can't be like have room for improvement and it's not still out there. Of course, we should always focus on growth. But I was like, what's some supporting evidence to like back what's your point? Like I just like what's some credible, because I think it would help me understand. And he's like, you know what? That's a good point. He's like, I don't really have any supporting evidence per se. It's just kind of what I feel with the media and stuff like that. And like, and I somebody challenged me on
It's
a
a big
topic.
problem.
Yeah, somebody challenged me on a topic like that too, where I was sharing a more left leaning friend of mine. He's like, "What supporting evidence do you have on that?" And I was like, I like had to like, you know,
It's anecdotal.
drop
A
my
lot of people become anecdotal.
yeah, I had to drop my pride a little bit, and I was like, I guess there's not much supporting evidence. It's just how I feel. So, I think there's a lot of feelings going on, but I think if we just take a step back, and Jordan Peterson would always ask somebody, like if you've watched any like interviews or talks of his, he's like, "Do you have life better than your parents did?" And that's what I, asked LaShawn too. I was like, is there more opportunities for you than your parents? And he's like, yeah, with technology and this and if you can provide, and if we can keep providing better opportunities for our kids, I do think there is so much progress being made. So I think if we can start having conversations with people we don't agree with by mutually acknowledging progress and then say, okay, now what are the areas we can improve? And if we can have conversations with people we don't agree with, acknowledge some form of progress, which is good. So it's not like the world is fucking burning down, which just seems to like be what I like. I don't think obviously the Capitol riot was bad, but if you think about like and people are make like US is the laughing stock like that, by the way, like comments like that drive me crazy too. US is like the laughing stock of the world. Like you think North Korea, the people that are like getting killed for not laughing or crying the right way, care about like we stormed the Capitol, or like people in China that don't have a First Amendment, that if they speak against their president, like they would probably love the idea of living in this country and having the rights we do. So it's like we have a lot to be grateful for. So I think starting off there, and one riot like we had, like when was the last time there was a Capitol riot like that? Like it's been like decades,
Well, there
right?
never been. There's never been what happened there. I mean, that was 1814 was the last time there actually been like an attack on like
Yeah.
the U.S. Capitol, and that
Yeah,
was probably
so again, maybe this is me looking glass half full, and this is not a defense of anybody storming the Capitol, to be clear. Like, I think anybody involved in serious planning or violence should be, held legally liable for sure. But, like, I don't, we've had one of those in 200 years. I think that's like a success. Like, we've all gotten along. We haven't had a civil war in a long time. Like, I think there's a lot of good progress that has been made. Again, not that we can't focus on growth, but maybe this is my white privilege talking, right? But I think that's where we start. And every time, and again, I'm just using LaShawn because he's going to be on my show next week, and we just talked about this last night, so it's fresh in my mind. He shares points to me that always help my perspective too. So I was like, okay, there's no supporting like evidence that you can share with me right now. Not saying it doesn't exist, but that I'm sure there is some evidence he could come up with that supports it. But I'm like, how do we make you feel better? So then we're like addressing different things. So how can I make you not feel this way, LaShawn? And then like he can think about that. Like, okay, well, if this was happening, maybe I'll feel better. So it's just, again, this is like me ranting about this now, but having these conversations, acknowledging some common ground and progress, which, the good thing about being in the US is there's not too many countries that can be compared that they're doing better than us. It's like, okay,
yeah.
if we're doing so bad, what's another place that's doing better? Oh, well, it doesn't exist. Okay, well, although room for improvement, we're probably the best place to be right now. How can we work together to accomplish what you want? I don't know if all that makes sense, but that's my feeling on that.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think the challenge is that like you just said, like you've spent years and years and tens of thousands of dollars to invest in yourself to develop those skills, right? To be able to have those conversations and think that way. Most people are never going to invest in themselves to that level, or even think about investing in themselves to better themselves. I think it's the other challenge. Just until we can get past the point of uh, labeling people and putting people in buckets, and also trying to adjust whose viewpoint is more valuable than others, it's we're also going to struggle. Like we need to get to a point where everybody is equal. Everyone's voice should be equal. Everyone's opinion should be equal in terms of it's like whether it's what they say is listened to, right? It could be just they say a bunch of bullshit, and that's like, what you said is wrong and terrible. But like everyone should be able to share and be listened to. Like I don't think we operate in that reality right now. I think there are um, certain groups that are their voice has more weight, and certain groups where your voice is not listened to as much because of certain reasons, and and it's challenging to bring people together and build acceptance across the board and get everyone on the same page if you're fracturing people and saying your voice is worth less than my voice and you're not allowed to speak on this topic because of your this and this. Like I don't know how you bring people together, and I don't understand the logic of that, of how you bring people together by saying that we're not equal. And that's essentially what's happened with a lot of conversations right now is unless you're part of a certain group, you aren't allowed to have an opinion on this. And if you do share something, you're automatically labeled something, and you shouldn't be listened to. And I think that's again like we need to get past that as well and be like, hey, every human being is equal. Every human being, every American has the right to share their voice. Every American has the right to be heard. Every American, whether you're black, white, Jewish, Christian, man, woman, like we are all human beings. We're all Americans, and we all should listen to each other and love each other and accept each other's views. We can disagree. We can decide we don't want to be friends, right? Like I just don't agree with you enough that I don't want to hang out with you. I don't want to be friends with you. I disagree with too much stuff. That's one thing. But like we should all, I think if every person had that baseline respect, like out of the gate, I think things would be a lot better. But like that doesn't exist. Like there's not that baseline out of the door respect and equality. It's like we're ranking people. Like because you have this, and this, you rank here. Because you have this, and this, you rank down here in terms of the conversation and dialogue. And that is going to get nowhere. Like that might feel like progress for a little bit, but long term, that's not going to get the results people want.
Yeah, for sure. And not to, one last thing, not to like just spotlight LaShawn here, but if, when we do talk about stuff and he's had some, really bad interactions with police in the past. So when he shares certain stories like that with me, I'm able to be like, okay, although we may not see eye to eye, so, and this is an important part, I can understand why he may feel that way. So it's like a level of like empathy, right? It's like, okay, we maybe don't agree, but because of his experience and his upbringing and what he dealt with, I can understand how he feels that way. And I guess I would just challenge like if a capitalist should be having more conversations with socialists, right? And vice versa. Hey, socialism is like the conservatives that are like, fuck socialism. When's the last time you talked to a socialist and say, okay, well, you grew up with no money. You like your parents never had success. They got fired and went job to job. Like, so although you may not agree with their ideology, you say, okay, you could see why they didn't go to college because they couldn't afford it or whatever it was. Like, you can see why they think the way they do, right? Even though you don't agree, you can say, okay, I could see why this way of like doing things from a government standpoint makes sense to you. So just like, and if not that this is like gonna happen tomorrow, but if like, and I don't think there's a high percentage of racists in the country. I don't know what the percentage is, but let's just say it's 5%. I think racism is removed pretty heavily, but it's still millions of Americans that are racist. I'm just pulling that number out of my ass. 5%. Like Democrats and progressives and even people on the right that are obviously very against racism, let's start having more conversations with these racists, not just like calling them pieces of shit, whatever. It's just like, okay, why do you feel, and again, this may not be popular, but this is what like therapists and stuff do. Like, okay, you dislike this race or ethnicity or this religion. Why do you feel that way? Well, when my mom was a kid, this happened and she was bullied, or my church taught me this. And it's like, okay, don't agree with you at all, but at least I'm taking the first step to understand why your brain is wired like that. Like, that's the
Well,
first step,
yeah, it's action. So if you look at like Chris Voss, one of the probably the foremost hostage negotiator in the world, was led the FBI's hostage negotiation team, and now is like a corporate consultant on deal making. Right? We've all he's on his masterclass we've done, read his books and stuff. In his books, he talks about like that is I forget the exact story. I'm going to mess up all the details, but basically it was like you had this guy who was a horrible racist, and he had a neighbor or somebody that would check in on him and was a minority. And over time, through those interactions and through dialogue, he started realizing like, I don't like, it basically forced him to question why he thought that way. Because a lot of people that have horrible views have those horrible views, not because of experience or real world experience, but because they were brought up that way. Right. So if you grew up in an isolated community where your parents and your grandparents and your uncles and your aunts and all these people all have a terrible viewpoint, you're going to have that terrible viewpoint because you don't know anything else. But if you start having conversations and dialogues with those people that you had that crazy view of, and you're like, why? This doesn't make sense. They said that this group, this religion, this race, like does these things, but like this, I love this person. We have great conversations. That's how you break that, right? Like, I think that needs to be, and it's hard to do because, I don't want to say like what you just said. I don't want to say like, let's have conversations with the racists. Like, that sounds terrible. Like you want to condemn people that are evil and have evil views, but at the same time, you need to think past that and think, well, what's worse than not condemning those people, letting that ideology perpetuate and expand? Like, that should be even worse, is not stopping it and not doing something when you could do something. And the only way you change somebody's view is by having them experience something that's counter to what they believe. And I'd imagine that, again, just an assumption here, that most people who have viewpoints like this have those viewpoints because they have had very, very few, if any, interactions with the people that have those viewpoints of. And if they had more interactions, they probably realize that my viewpoints are stupid, foolish, and moron, and have no grounding. There's no basis for them. And you could break those cycles. So when that person that has a family and kids, guess what? Those kids aren't going to have that viewpoint. They're going to have a viewpoint that all people are great, all people are equal, we should love all people. But yeah, it's a tough thing to say. It's not a popular thing to say, like what you just said, because it automatically gets lumped into you're condoning that behavior. It's like, no, like we should all want to stop that behavior, not just put it like, by not addressing it and just labeling it, all you're doing is taking evil and putting it in a bottle. You're not emptying the bottle. You're just like putting a bottle and you're putting it on a shelf and hoping that it doesn't break out, right? You're just hoping like, let's just put it over here and hope it doesn't fester and grow and expand. That's not a solution, right? Like, you need to say, well, how can we destroy this? How can we make this not exist in the first place? Not how can we just put these people in a bucket and throw that bucket over to this point of the internet? Like, that's a terrible solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously they're not popular conversations to have, but just as a civilization, and I'm not perfect at this, but I feel like I've been working hard to take strides, just being more curious rather than just shitting on somebody for their viewpoint, which again, I'm not perfect. There was literally a guy at the university club that hopefully he doesn't listen to this, but the first thing I ever heard out of his mouth, we were having a dinner and we meet new people there all the time. Literally, first thing I heard out of his mouth was, I'm a like clinical socialist or something, like he said. Like, he's like Canadian and he just like does not like the American system in a lot of ways. First thing I ever heard of his mouth. So I will admit, in that time, I wasn't very curious. I should have been like, where does that, like, or not should, but I want to start being more like, where does that come from? Like, where did you think that way? Like, why do you think Canada's system is better than the United States system? Just then we can maybe find some common ground. Okay, don't necessarily agree, but I kind of see where you're coming from. I was judgmental of that, and I was standoffish immediately. I was like, oh man, someone that the first thing out of his mouth is I'm a socialist, like that's weird, right? But like not even I don't even know his name. I just that's what he said. Like
Well, and the irony of being in a members only elite group that costs a good amount of money every year. That's what's kind of ironic.
yeah, that was funny. That's what I told my buddy there too. I'm like, I don't know if it's true socialism if you're in part of a premium like executive business owner club, but interesting. The point is like that's areas for me to grow is just being more curious. Like I wonder why this person views this has these type of views because everybody in their soul and heart believes their viewpoints are the right viewpoints, right? Like obviously, that's why everybody's so fucking emotional and gets in so many arguments. So, and I know these are hard things to do, and also think about for anybody that's ever been to therapy or like we've created these patterns for a lifetime. So say you're 30 years old and you're being told that you're a piece of shit for your view on this issue. Like it takes potentially, probably months at a very least, months or years. You spent 30 years building these habits and belief systems. Just one person being like, fuck you, you racist. That's not going to be like, you know what? All these 30 years of belief systems and training out the window. I view everybody as equal now. It's going to take some self-reflecting and realizing where these belief systems came from and stuff like that to change some hard conversation. So, this is something I'm obviously passionate about. Like maybe, I'm going to continue to do that in my own life and encourage my kids one day to do that. And, I do think that can make a big difference and I think that's, again, I don't know if it will inevitably happen, but I view that as the only solution that at least I can see right now of
Yeah.
all the craziness going on.
Yeah. I mean, if you just take a step back and realize that my opinions and viewpoints in life are just that, opinions and viewpoints, and with the exception of certain things that are universal facts, right? Like we all agree like 1 + 1 = 2, right? There's certain things that we can all just like they're just facts. We don't argue with. Like gravity exists. Like I throw an apple in the air, it comes down. But like everything else, like we need to understand and realize like that you can't be right? There's no like right or wrong. If you think about history, like think how many billions of people have lived on this planet and how many billions of people have believed in this religion or this religion or this religion. Like all these billions of people that believe in these religions, like they believe that their book and their belief system is right, and that every other, all the other billions of people are wrong. Like, and same thing with countries, right? You look at like World War I, World War II, like both those wars, you had tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people on both sides who at their core believed that what they were fighting for, what they were doing was right. Or like factually, like the acts of evil, right? The Germans and the Japanese and the Italians, like their citizen soldiers went out every day and believed that the Americans and the British and the Russians they're the enemy. They are evil and they believe in these things. And we on our side, we said no, they're evil, right? And we agreed that hey, dictatorships are evil and these things are evil. Like it's if you start thinking about the perspective that there's like throughout history been billions of people that were on the other side and they believed deep down that they were right. Like they went to bed every night, woke up every morning, that what they did every day, what they do is like that's what they should be doing. And that's the right way to do things. And everyone else that does things differently is wrong. Like it changes your perspective a little bit. Like I think you have to be very either egotistical or ignorant to believe that like my view of the world is actually a factual reality in every facet. And anybody that disagrees with it is factually wrong and inaccurate. Like, I think once you get past that point, it becomes a little easier to have open dialogues. Because, like, listen, I believe in capitalism. I believe in free markets. But I also recognize that 200 years from now, 400 years from now, 1,000 years from now, will there be some better system that's been developed? And they're looking back at this time and saying, remember that time they thought that the best economic system was free market capitalism, and they'd have a hybrid between socialism. Like, listen, that could be a reality. Like, it's just an opinion. Like, there's data to support it, but at the end of the day, like there's data to support other sides, and there's data to support other viewpoints. So I think if you get past that point where you believe that your view on the world, whether it's social issues, economic issues, is a there's no right or wrong. Like there's no yes. It's not binary. It's not one or zero. There's spectrums of it. Again, it's these are tough conversations to have, but like 300 years ago plus, most people in the world thought that slavery was okay. Like that's insane. Like today, us looking at that is absolutely insane. Like how any like civilized human being could believe that owning another human being is in any way good or okay or moral. Isn't like we can't even fathom it. But during that time, most people thought that was normal. And so but there's people in our society now who think, well, if I was around 300 years ago, I would have done it differently. It's like, no, you wouldn't have, because you are a child of your surroundings.
You were
and
raised
everybody in your world.
Yeah.
Yeah. If everyone in the world does things a certain way and believes things a way, you're going to believe it that way. So I think it's like, if we can look at those things, say like people used to believe this and we think that's crazy. I guarantee you 300 years from now, 1,000 years from now, people are going to look back and they're going to look back at things that we did today. And they're going to say, can you believe they used to, put these devices close to their body? They didn't realize that this was giving them like weird diseases. Can you believe that they used to like domesticate animals? Like, can you believe they used to do this, this, and this? Like, and we're going to look like idiots in history books that we did things a certain way. So I think we just get up the fact.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. I was actually going to ask you, I asked a friend of mine this recently. I think it's a good question to kind of unrelated to the topic, but I still think, what do you think in 2120, or I guess 2121, right? 2121, 100 years from now. What do you think we look back at 2021 and say, like, what are the top 3 things we look back and be like, what the fuck were they thinking? 100 years from now.
I think 100 years from now we get, because like some type of singularity or like a merger with computers, I think we do get past like the whole political stuff. I think like that there used to be a time where like we just let a bunch of individuals decide, like one individual got to decide what we did and a group of individuals decided this. I think at some point, 100 years from now, 20 years from now, it's a lot of that is done purely through computers, where this is the optimal decision. It's not based on opinion anymore. It's based on like people's opinions. A lot of times can be wrong and bad. Like we're irrational and emotional. So I'd imagine that that's gonna be a big one, is like people like looking back 100 years from now and saying, can you believe they used to make like big decisions about the economy and about the environment based on like a few votes? And like they didn't just use the data purely, and they used the data for that decision.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. I've actually never thought of that. I think the obvious ones for me are the mass slaughtering of animals that we have. Like we have huge farms that just slaughter millions of cows and chickens a year inhumanely. Obviously, there's organizations like PETA who can be somewhat extreme, but I think their initial purpose was very, very beneficial to society. Just animals are skinned for purses and just stuff like that. I think we're like, even looking back 20, 30 years ago, we're just like, what the hell? Definitely pollution too. I think is going to be a big one. Not that I'm saying we need to just like, like shut down fossil fuels right now. It's a tricky transition because of what's going on, but we definitely treat the earth pretty poorly. We litter like crazy. So those seem to be the easiest ones that I think we can make some giant progress in over the next 100 years. Access to education for everybody's big too, because everybody will have access to the internet. So I feel like poverty, again, not that there won't be people living in poverty, there probably always will be at some level, but we'll continue to just be a more wealthy world, just because access to information and commerce will be worldwide at that point,
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think just even like education will be different, because I think people look 100 years from now, 200 years from now, they'll look back and say, like, can you believe they used to like read individual books and that's how I used to learn. They didn't just have instant access to all the information because there'll be some type of like neural implant that'll just you'll be able to just like you're thinking right now instantly pull in that information. So like that'll be foreign at some point to most people. They're like, this is the way you used to have to get information into your brain and store it and recall it. It was like very manual, and it wasn't just done automatically.
That's just wild to think about. But yeah, I mean, that's Elon Musk's vision, right? That's what he's talked about with his chip and stuff. So,
Your
final,
Neuralink.
yeah, there you go. Final question to just circle back on the big tech challenge that we kind of like started the convo with. What do you feel the best solution is there? Like what result would you personally be happy with?
I think there needs to be some type of private, like third party board association, like oversight committee that is in charge of like certain big. It's hard because it can't be government, right? Government can't be the answer because most of our politicians don't understand how any of this works in the first place. Even if they did, I still wouldn't want them having control over it. But some type of private sector solution where it's a blend and a mix of thought leaders and even maybe individuals that just like shareholders at Apple's meeting get to vote on things, like something that has some greater level of accountability over these companies. But it's I don't know because I struggle with this a lot because there's a big part of me that believes as a kind of free market person that there shouldn't be any true intervention oversight, that in a true free market companies should be able to compete and that people vote with their dollars, and if enough people are truly sick of this company, that it should go out of business. Like that's the way it should operate. The challenge though I think is that we've never experienced companies this big in the history of the world that are this deeply rooted into so many I consider them utilities. Like I don't think they're even companies. I think like a lot of them aren't considered utilities, just like power and water. And that's a different story. Like, power and water and other utilities are regulated. They're treated differently than, private enterprise to some extent. So yeah, I think there eventually will need to be some type of oversight, but done like in a private sector setting, not done by the government. Because you can't have, at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that having like, 3 or 4 dudes that basically control the entire world is not good, especially if they're not elected and they have no accountability. Like Zuckerberg and Bezos and Dorsey, these guys like have zero accountability. Like they're technically they're accountable to the shareholders, but even Zuckerberg, like the way the stock's structured, he owns a certain preferred type of stock that gives him way more voting rights. So like even if a lot of shareholders wanted to do something, it would be really hard for them to remove him from leadership. So you have like one dude that's basically unremovable from his office that wasn't put there by any American that controls how 2.5 billion people basically consume content, socialize, interact, hours every day. So I think there needs to be something put in place, some checks on those people. Like what that looks like, I don't know, but I imagine at some point some solutions created, some type of oversight committee.
Yeah, some association that has. Yeah, that's a good idea. I sent you that article the other day that compared big tech
About the railroads.
to the railroads, and that's actually a great analogy because essentially in the 1800s, if the railroad decided, which was I like basically what all owned by Rockefeller, like if I get the name wrong, I'm sorry who, but there was a very similar structure. A few people controlled the railroads in the whole country, and if they decided that for whatever reason they didn't want to go by your city and drop off goods and products and food and like that would destroy your city, that would destroy jobs, that would destroy your ability to get certain products. And the same thing for shipping out, like that would destroy any businesses that were producing goods, foods, and clothing, and they wouldn't be able to ship out and expand their business outside of their town, right? So it's There are a lot of overlaps with railroads, and the government had to get involved eventually and have some sort of regulation over the railroads. And I'm a small government guy, but treating these as utilities is probably the first step. Like the cable companies and electric companies are like private businesses, but they can't just do whatever they want either, because they are classified as utilities. And I don't really like government getting involved in too many things, but I just don't see any other option at this point. And I think this may be the final straw where conservatives will agree with regulating the social companies, because Elizabeth Warren was like big about that. If you remember in the Democratic primaries, she was like,
Yeah.
we need to break up these companies, we need to regulate them, which I'm actually have opened my mind to, which is, I guess progress on my end. I'm agreeing with Elizabeth Warren on the record here on a very big issue. But you look at Amazon, for example, AWS is what makes all their profit, right? And then the Amazon retail business loses money, and they're able to not, like, we didn't even talk about this, but because of the profits generated from AWS, they can basically go in the hole, putting all their competition out of business on the retail side. And what do you know? Amazon doesn't report any profit. Thus, they don't pay any corporate taxes. So, they have all this power over.
And now they're buying jets, so they're going to be able to compete. They're going to take down probably all the shipping, all the FedEx. If I'm FedEx or USPS or UPS, I'm terrified. They're going into retail to be able to compete with, like grocery. They'll be able to compete with grocery stores. I think like what you're saying is, at some point, there's going to be an intervention free. Like either way, the free market system won't exist in a true 100% fashion, because either it'll be these big companies that stifle the free market, because if you basically, with the way Apple, Amazon, Facebook, these companies are set up, Google, you can't compete with them. So if you want to enter those markets, it's impossible. Like true competition is almost impossible. Like every year, Apple puts out of business like a dozen companies, like big companies, because they come out with their own native app in their phone.
Yeah.
Right. Like every year. And when they came out with Apple Music, they Spotify all of a sudden dropped like 10 points in the search rankings in Apple. So they didn't do it. But like Amazon can basically private label their own stuff, push people down the rankings. So yeah, I think it's whether the government does it or whether these big companies do it, somebody's going to stifle the free market. And I'd rather it be like, break these companies up or oversee them so that there's at least true competition and there's some fairness in the market, so somebody can actually compete with Amazon or Apple. Because like the way they are now, there's 0% chance that anybody like today can start a company. It's like, in 10 years, I'm going to take on Amazon. Like, that's a joke, right? Especially after COVID. Like all that happened in the last 12 months is like Amazon, Walmart, Google, Apple, these companies just got like 10 times
richer
more
than
resilient
ever.
and bigger. Yeah.
That's the greatest irony of and there's a lot of them in COVID, but maybe the biggest is that these government policies, these mostly leftist government policies, the lockdowns, not only put a ton of people out of work, but the companies that they despise, the wealthiest people, made them richer,
way richer,
because of mostly democratic policies. Because if these places were open, like, Florida has been rebounding for a while now. I've like never thought I would be so grateful. Like I didn't even know what the difference was living from state to state, other than state income tax, until this whole thing. But yeah, I'm just like, it's wild. So, but yeah, well, it was good having you on. It was good having me on the Unicorn Perspective.
It was good having you on.
Yeah. It's good having me on your
both
show.
of us on.
Yeah, it was good having you on my show, and it was good having me on your show. So, but yeah, it was fun, man. So,
yeah, we could do this on a regular basis to just do a opinion on what's going on. Maybe it's like a monthly thing we do.
Yeah, it's a little less work we have to do in finding guests, so I'm down for that.
Yeah, it makes things easier. Easier is good.
Yep, sounds good, man. All right, peace.